This is exactly how students are selected for trips based on their preferences and all of the other factors. There are 3 rounds. Each trip will get first pick of all students who listed their trip as the first preference. For example, if Alaska has 34 students who selected their trip first, Team Alaska can select any of those 34 students to fill their 25 student roster. Team Honduras can select any number of the 7 students who selected their trip first as part of the 15 student roster. Already you can see that some trips are more popular than others. In this example, I am implying that Alaska is more popular of a trip than Honduras for the first preference. This is not always true, so you should not use this example as a basis for your selections. If Alaska fills their 25 student roster from students who selected their trip first, that means there would be 9 students left over who did not get their first trip preference. This is why some people who put Alaska first will not get their first trip preference. Team Honduras, however, can select any number of the 7. If a student selected Honduras first and they had room on their trip to put them there, that does not mean that they are required to put that student on their trip. It is important that the chaperones review their applications and recommendations. There is also discussion among faculty and staff to determine if a student is a good fit for a specific trip. We also prayerfully consider these options before coming into selection. We believe that God has His hand over all of our teams in many ways. The second round begins with each trip now selecting of all students who were not selected in round 1 and selected their trip as a second preference. For example, if a student listed Alaska first and North Carolina second, that student may not have been selected for Alaska, but now North Carolina has dibs on the student and may or may not select the student for their trip. So if North Carolina's trip is already filled after round 1, a student who selected Alaska first and North Carolina second may get bumped to their third preference because these trips are already filled and popular. Again, this is just an example. Round 3 will continue exactly like round 2 with any remaining students. So if a student selected Alaska first, North Carolina second, and Kenya third, and Kenya still had spots available, they would likely select that student for the trip. Reasons that student may not be selected for any of their top 3 choices are if a student selected trips that were all popular and filled within the first 3 rounds. If a student selected a trip that they cannot go on because of sports, if you are participating in a baseball or softball or volleyball tournament or practice during specific days that a trip is taking place. Another option may be if we do not feel like a student is mature either spiritually or otherwise to participate in the trip. Another reason why students may not be selected for one of their top 3 trips is if we do not feel like they are mature enough for the travel that is required for a trip. For example, our Australia trip requires a 30-hour total travel time, 18 hours on a plane, and 10 hours on a bus in order to get to their location. This is not for the faint of heart, and not all students may be medically or otherwise prepared to take such a venture. Most students will be invited to join one of their top 3 trip preferences. However, there are some students who will not be selected for one of their top 3. This is nothing to necessarily be concerned about, as there are many reasons that I've already discussed for why a student may not be selected for one of their top 3 preferences. After selection, students will receive an email letting them know what trip they've been selected for, inviting them to participate in that trip. If your student has been invited for a trip, they then must respond accepting the invitation to that trip, denoting that they are accepting the financial responsibility for that specific trip. Any questions that you have about the trip can be found on vcs.servicereef.com or by contacting the lead chaperone. If your student no longer wants to participate in the trip they have been invited to, they can simply decline the invitation. Remember, it is required that a student participate in either Engage Arizona, Engage US, or Engage Global. So if they decline an invitation, they do have to participate in some opportunity. Now, normally at the end of our selection process, there are some trips that have not been completely filled. We have some open spots. And we also have students who didn't get one of their top 3 choices. At this time, an email will be sent out to those students telling them that they were not selected for one of their top 3. However, we would love for you to participate in an Engage trip, and these are your options for what trips are still available and still have openings. You will then, as the student or parent, be required to respond to that email claiming a spot on that team. This happens in some ways on a first come, first served basis in how we fill our teams for those that still have options and openings. However, all chaperones and engaged staff have the opportunity to decline a student if we feel for whatever reason that that student is not a good fit for the team. By the time of our first parent meeting, all students will have had to accept or decline and paid a $100 deposit denoting that they are confirmed for sure going on that trip, of course barring any extenuating circumstances. So if you have any other questions about this process, be sure to reach out to us at engage@valleychristianaz.org. Thank you.